What's up, everybody? This is John from Coding Addict, and welcome to another JavaScript Nuggets video. And in this video, I'll take a look at the Fetch API, which is a browser API for HTTP requests, and just seemed like a logical next step in our asynchronous code journey. As far as Fetch API, since it's provided by the browser, it's available right away. In other words, we don't need to import anything, and the setup is extremely straightforward as well. By default, it performs a GET request, just like the browser. Essentially reads data from the server, but it supports other HTTP methods as well. What's interesting, Fetch returns a promise, which should ring a bell, since we did cover promises quite extensively in a previous series videos. As far as syntax, it goes something like this, where we need to go with fetch, and the first argument it's looking for is the URL. Now, for this example, I'm going to use the endpoint that is coming from my own server, and if you took my React course, you're probably familiar with this URL, but of course you can pass in whichever URL you want. And the only reason why I'm using my own URL is simply because I know that there are not going to be changes on the server anytime soon. And once we pass in the URL, what's really interesting is that it returns a promise. And just to showcase that, I'm going to go with log here, and then let's move the fetch up and check it out. Now, of course, we have a promise. So this is what the fetch returns. And of course, we know that since we have the promise, we can use .then and .catch. So I'll leave this one for your reference. Let's go again with fetch URL. So we pass in the URL, and then we're going to go with .then and catch. And as far as the catch, we'll simply go with error, and here we'll log the error. And when it comes to response, by default, it's not going to have a JSON format. Now, in order to access that response, of course, we do need to pass in the callback function. And then the first argument over here is going to be the data that is coming back. And of course, it is a parameter, so you can call it whatever you want. So in my case, I'm going to go with the response. And just to showcase that the format is not going to be JSON, I'm going to go with console log. And then we're going to be looking for response. And you'll see in a console that effectively we have a body, and that's going to be a readable stream. And then if we want to turn this into a JSON, we need to look at the prototype. And then in there, we'll find a JSON function. And essentially what we need to do is just run a response. So that's the data that is coming back. And then we need to invoke that JSON. Now, what's interesting, that JSON returns another promise. And what that simply means is that we can chain another .then, just like we did in the previous videos. So in here, instead of console logging, I'm going to go with response and then JSON. So invoke the function. And then since I know that it returns a promise, I'll chain another .then. And now I'll finally have the data. So I'm going to go here with data and then another console log. And of course, if we take a look in a console, we'll see array of 5 items. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. And since we also covered async await, I'll also show you how we can set up the same functionality with async await. So this is just going to be a .then approach, where again, we have fetch, we pass in the URL. And then if we want to turn this into the JSON, we just invoke JSON method. And then of course, we'll get the data, or if there is an error, of course, we'll console log it. However, there is a gotcha. And I'll spend a separate video on fetch errors because it's not as straightforward as you might think. And now let me just comment this out just so it stays for your reference. And let's rewrite this using async await. Since we covered async await in the previous videos, and we know that it can significantly improve our code. And let's start by creating a function getTours. Now it's going to be a async function. So I'm going to say here async. As far as parameters, we're not going to pass anything. And then let's just set up try and catch. And if there is an error, of course, we'll log it. We'll say over here error. And then in the try block, we're going to go with const. And then this is going to be my response. And of course, since I have async, I can use await. And then we go again with fetch and URL. Now, of course, if you want to make this function dynamic, you can pass in the URL over here. That's really up to you. But since it's a simple example, I'll just hard code it over here inside of the try block. And then since we want to see what we're going to get as far as response, I'm going to go to getTours. So now, of course, we invoke the function. And of course, in the try block, also console log it. And again, we get back this response, but it is not in a JSON format. And then remember, since JSON returns another promise, you can simply write something like this, where I go with const data is equal to response and then JSON. But of course, I'll stick the await in front of it. And now only once I get back my data, I'll console log. And once I save in the console, I have array of 5 items. Now, lastly, I just want to mention one thing where when it comes to async, remember by default, it always returns a promise. So if your functionality is different, where instead of doing something with a data, now, of course, again, that something is just console log, you're actually returning data. And in order to showcase that, I'll just comment out the console log and I'll say return data. If we go with another console log here and we pass in the tours, you'll notice that, of course, we're returning a promise, correct? And then we have array of 5 items. And if we want to access it, of course, we need to go with .then, and then we'll have access to that data. Now, where I'm going with this is simply the fact that if you remove this await and simply go with return, the result is going to be exactly the same. So if I'll remove it, notice again, we have the promise and then we can see that it is fulfilled. And the result is going to be that array of 5 items. But again, in order to access it, since we're returning a promise, we'll have to use another .then. Again, that only matters if instead of right away applying the logic over here in the try block, you're returning those values that you're getting back, and then you're doing something with it. So in here, you can either await for that JSON and then return whatever is the variable name. In our case, of course, that was data, or you can simply return JSON since we're returning the promise regardless.